down the line. We maybe start with Greg, and then Rumi, and then Dave Baskin, and Skip Ranker, our panelists for today. Now we have a small, intimate group, so we might just have a dialogue back and forth. Who knows, once we get going. But go ahead, Greg, if you'd like to start us off.
Sure. I represent unity, and everyone right away goes, is that Unitarian? and we're not. We're headquartered in Kansas City, Missouri, and we have about 900 ministries in North America, 1,200 worldwide. And where we began, we're like we would probably be considered a Protestant church because we're Christian-based, but we actually began in the late 1800s with other what are called New Thought religions or spiritual paths. So we came up with the likes of Mary Baker Eddy with Divine Science, Science of Mind with Ernest Wilson, the likes of that. So those would be sister ministries of ours. And what they were doing at the time was trying to integrate much of what you were talking about, science with faith and religion. And they were studying different spiritual paths, not just the Western Christianity, but also the Eastern spiritual paths. And at that time, there were a lot of symposiums because you wouldn't have the TV or anything, so people would go to symposiums. If you didn't read, you would go and you would hear speakers. So a lot of these people were going to the Boston area or to Chicago, where the big symposiums were, where people would come from, people like Yogananda from India, or you had Emerson, Thoreau, those type of thinkers. And so what Unity did was it tried to integrate all of these different spiritual paths into a way of being, into applying them practically in our lives. So they became known as, or called themselves perhaps, practical Christianity. So it was honoring all of the diverse spiritual paths and recognizing, for us, we say there's one God, many paths. There's not one right, perfect path, not even unity. So wherever you are, we honor that you're right where you're supposed to be. So one of the things that makes us unique is that we're not arrogant enough to say that we have the answer, and if you don't have the answer, you're going to go to this place somewhere. We're all about integrating and going with evolution too, and incorporating those ideas with our faith. So we're about asking the questions, how does this make sense to you? How does this work in your life? How are you applying this? And so that resonated with me. I grew up Catholic. I was raised Catholic, loved it, very much involved. But then some of the ideas weren't resonating with me. And I was studying theology when I went to university also, and I started asking the priest questions. And I said, but we know this, this, and this, but you're saying this on Sunday. And I remember so clearly him saying, but the people aren't ready for it. I just remembered that. I was, just around your age, and he told me the people aren't ready for it. And I thought, but I'm ready for it. And at the time also, I was just discovering my sexuality, and I was gay. And so I had to integrate this with the Catholicism. And so, although I was very welcomed, very loved, part of the community, I was one of the extraordinary ministers and teaching and so forth, I felt, I don't fit this dogma anymore. This dogma doesn't serve what I know of who I am, which is a perfect child of God. And so I thought, I have to leave. And I had no faith. I looked at Hinduism and various other faiths. Nothing worked, so I thought, oh, well, I guess I'm just who I am. And then I found the Unity Church in Houston about 15 years later after school. And it was a big church, about 900 people, and they were saying everything I already believed. And so I knew this was the path for me. Never thought I was going to be a minister, though, because I always thought for myself, I carried around this belief that because I was gay, I was going to hit a ceiling. Much like women nowadays, still, even to this day, there are ceilings with income, with the way people perceive you versus male. And so I just thought, I don't want to deal with that. But then Unity is one of the religions that does embrace diversity, and they do ordain openly gay people. And so I thought, well, I'll find out if there's a ceiling, because this is obviously where I'm supposed to be now. So I moved here. This is my first ministry. I'm at Unity in Bay City. We're about just a little over 100 members now. We've doubled in size this last year since I've been there. And I love being here. The community is amazing. And that's probably about it. We're very much about asking the questions and about what it can mean in your life. What do these things mean? What do the stories mean from the Bible if you look at the Bible? Our view of Bible is very different from most other Christians in that we focus on the teachings of Jesus, or what we understand or are told are the teachings of Jesus, because Jesus never wrote anything. Nothing was recorded in his time except what was spoken. So we focus on that, and we look at all of the different Bibles or books of the Bibles as a reflection of the consciousness of those authors at the time. What did they know at the time? What did they understand at the time? And that's what they were expressing from. So things like, of course, God was up above because the belief was the land was flat. So if the world was flat and you're going to go to a heaven somewhere, it was going to be up above. So you'd go to the mountain to pray. So even today, we look up to pray. Is God up there? Unity would say God is everywhere. God, yes. Oops.
God turned off the lights.
Yes. We would say that God is up above.
I just turned them back on. Did you like that?
You are God. You are God-like.
Yeah. So for us, God is everywhere. We don't limit it, and we're always asking the question and encouraging people to ask questions for themselves. So we're pretty unique, and it fits my belief about always evolving and growing. Because even as individuals, I think the things we believed as children, we don't believe anymore. Now, did life change, or did we change? Did our awareness change? And I think as a world and society, we're changing. And so we don't try to be another religion. We don't... the founders back in the 1800s, they didn't want to be a religion. They were a study group that were meant to support other faiths to come in and then practice these truths, what they were studying. So it's pretty different and unique, and works for me.
Thanks for
Time up.
Thanks for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks, Greg. So it's interesting as sort of Greg was walking us through sort of his experiences and his spirituality and faith, where it stands now. I was seeing a lot of parallels. So let me start with the parallels, and then I'll share with you a little bit about myself. So one parallel, so my name is Rumi Shahzad, and I'm a Muslim. I was born in Lahore, Pakistan, and I spent the first 19 years of my life there, and the second half of my life, I would say, here in the United States. And the parallels that I see is that the way I look at faith, or the way I look at any religion, is sort of, it's one path leading in the direction of God Almighty, right? So Greg is sitting to my right, and Skip all the way to my left. And let's say God is sort of in the middle of the table. The analogy that one of the Sufi Maulanas who gave me was that, I have a different view towards God Almighty. Greg has a different view, and so does Skip. And
A different spoke.
Absolutely, that's a good way to put it. And I'm not sort of going to be a judge of what path somebody else is taking to God Almighty. And another quote that comes to my mind, that my older brother, Dr. Anwar, who's sort of also a resident of Saginaw here, he said to me that, just because you practice a specific faith does not make you more loved by God, right? So it just cannot be. So so that's sort of a parallel I wanted to draw in terms of sort of my own experiences growing up in a country that was sort of predominantly Muslim. I had sort of always curiosity around what makes the other faiths tick, sort of how is it practiced, what is it all about? Just like it's sort of reversed here, as we opened our first Islamic center, the new Islamic center in Saginaw 4 weeks ago, and we had an open house, and lots of folks came in, and that was the first time they had stepped inside a mosque. In a similar way, it was probably in my middle school that I stepped for the first time in a church, right? Then I came to the US, and I think coming here to study undergrad at the small liberal arts college, Ohio Wesleyan, New Columbus, Ohio. It's a Methodist school. And my true sort of interaction with other faiths began, and my journey of learning about other faiths began at Ohio Wesleyan, because before that, pretty much Islam was it, right? And in that journey, several people that helped me see the compassion and love of Christianity to begin with were sort of Chaplain John Powers, who chaplain at the university, and first week or second week into college, it was the month of Ramadan was starting, and we were trying to figure out sundown meal is not a problem. The cafeteria is open in the evening, but sun up meal is like 4:30 in the morning. We sort of trying to figure out what do we do. There's about 20 of us who were fasting. So I went to him, and he arranged the next morning the cafeteria to be open at 3:30 a.m. for us to sort of do the fasting with the support of the community. So that meant a lot to us. And over time, I ended up minoring in religion, other than my main subjects, fields of concentration, with economics and accounting, and learning about the other faiths, and again saw lots of sort of parallels. And the university chaplain there specifically was doing a lot of work related to interfaith dialogue. And he has been, I saw him this summer, it's been a little over 20 years since I got to know him. My wife Jennifer and I got to know him. And I'll share with you something that he sent out as a communication. He's doing sort of cutting-edge research and work around community building and interfaith dialogue in a small university town. Delaware, Ohio is perhaps 25,000 with about 16 to 1,800 students at Ohio Wesleyan. So it's like a university town, and sort of it's grown out of Columbus, Ohio. But here's a note that sort of talks to the community that he's been able to build. So this is a note he sent out last September, so just about a year ago. So some 20 years ago, as the Scud missiles hit the street of Tel Aviv, the Muslim students at Ohio Wesleyan went to the rooms of the Jewish students at Ohio Wesleyan. They knocked on their doors and said to them, "Do you have family in Tel Aviv? We want to be with you tonight, just to sit with you and pray with you." The next day, an Orthodox rabbi in Columbus called me and said, "I heard about what happened last night. Do you realize that if the streets of Tehran and Tel Aviv were at Ohio Wesleyan, there would have been no war?" At sundown last September 9, 2010, Chaplain John Powers sent a message to everyone at Ohio Wesleyan, and it said the following: "As I write, millions of people around the globe have entered into an unusual juxtaposition of sacred time. The overlay of the beginning of Rosh Hashanah with the end of Ramadan, and can we do the magic again?
Try.
She's got it.
Excellent. You're good. And the subsequent celebration of Eid. We in the Ohio Wesleyan community, who are neither Jewish nor Muslim, need to take heed that this is an unusually special moment for many sisters and brothers on campus. As faculty, staff, and students, I bid your sensitive awareness to these sacred hours in the lives of many in our community." And it goes on to sort of talk about what a tightly knit community Ohio Wesleyan is. And the point of reading this is not to sort of talk about one side or the other side, but how there are opportunities to work together. It's the same Ohio Wesleyan where they have had speakers from the late 80s who first came and talked about apartheid, came and talked about a similar apartheid in Palestine. So it's a forum where everybody can come and voice their views without feeling that one view is better than the other. It fosters the diversity of opinion, and to me, that sort of was my liberal arts education as I went through Ohio Wesleyan. The second experience I'll share sort of at my corporate life after my grad school at University of Chicago, having worked at two large financial services firms that shall remain unnamed, but in New York and Boston, what I saw was that they would respect the Sabbath and the Friday prayers for me, right? So Saturday, we were working 80 to 100-hour weeks in mergers and acquisitions, but sundown, Friday, before sundown, a couple of hours before, the practicing Jewish professionals could leave and be at their homes to practice the Sabbath. In a similar way, I had some of my colleagues come to me when I would be working away at my desk close to Friday prayer time and said, "Hey, what are you doing here? Make sure you find the time for that." So that awareness in the cafeteria, having the kosher and halal food to support the needs. And I think it's sort of win-win. It creates a sort of an environment that in which you don't feel excluded, but you feel that you are valued regardless of what faith or national origin or ethnicity you're bringing to the table. So it's a strict meritocracy, right? And that enables all of us to then pursue the American dream. So I wanted to share those couple of experiences with you, and I'm very glad to be here. And if there are any questions that we can drill deeper into, would be happy to. And thanks for the opportunity.
Good. Thank you.
And I'm Dave Baskind. I was born and raised Jewish. I was raised in both Cleveland and Chicago, where they have fairly large numbers of Jews. And even though I realized at an early age that I was in a minority religion, I always felt like there was a lot of acceptance and tolerance. I never felt any sense of prejudice against Jews, even though we were part of the minority culture, which is always kind of interesting, especially around the holiday season when you hear all the Christmas music and all the specials, and I love a lot of them. You don't see a whole lot of Jewish, specials. There's not a, Charlie Brown Hanukkah special. So I always realized that I was different in that regard, but I always took pride in my religion. And as I went through school, I was also going to Hebrew school on the weekends. Eventually, I did get bar mitzvahed when I was 13, which is typical. But around that time, my parents had gotten a divorce about a half year earlier, and I was really starting to feel kind of burnt out on going to religious school twice a week and practicing and studying for the bar mitzvah. And I had some friends who were in a similar boat too, by the way. And so my mom was just very adamant about the fact that I have to get to my bar mitzvah. After that, she wouldn't pressure me in terms of the religion. And so right after I got bar mitzvahed, I pretty much stopped going to temple. I didn't want anything to do with it. My mom made me get dressed up all nice for the high holidays, but that was about it. My family always celebrated the Sabbath at my grandparents' house on Friday nights. I would usually go there for that. And then after I went to dinner, I was pretty much free to do as I wished. So I didn't really have a whole lot of religious involvement for my late teens, even in my early 20s, when I was going to college at Miami of Ohio, where there's also a pretty strong Jewish community. I never participated in any events or activities involving Judaism. I never went to temple for the high holidays, none of that. And likewise, when I went to Bowling Green, I had a couple of Jewish friends. I went with them a couple of times to a temple. It was about 20 minutes away because there wasn't one in town, but that was about it. Towards the end of my academic career, though, I was in love with the woman Kelly, who eventually became my wife, and she wasn't exactly sure what she wanted to do in regard to her religious beliefs. She had been raised by parents who had two different religious beliefs, and she knew that I was Jewish and took an interest in it and asked questions, which I couldn't answer for her. And I encouraged her to get more knowledgeable, and she did, and she still knows way more about Judaism than I do. And so eventually, after learning more about Judaism, she decided to convert to Judaism. No pressure from me, a lot of pressure from my grandma for her to do that, but I never pressured her at all. And so she started the process of converting to Judaism about a year before we got married. And as she took religious classes and was learning more about the Jewish faith, the rabbis who were helping her learn more made a very logical statement. They said, if you're going to convert, you really ought to be coming to temple more often. And so my now wife said, okay, if I'm going to temple more often, guess what? you're coming with me. So I kind of went begrudgingly. And once I got there, I realized that I really did enjoy it. They had some great rabbis who made the services very interactive and fun, very musical. After services, it's typical to have something called an oneg, which is basically a little reception with some good food and wine afterwards, and I really enjoyed that. And I enjoyed the time that we were spending at the temple together. And my wife converted about maybe 5 or 6 weeks before we got married. And at that point, I was pretty hooked on it too. I was kind of it was almost like I reconverted to Judaism. I felt like it really was a rebirth for me, and that was terrific. And after my wife converted and we were married, we came up here to Saginaw, where the temple The one temple in Saginaw had closed right around the same time I arrived in the mid-1990s. I tried going to the temple in Bay City once. It didn't feel like a good fit for me. I didn't feel very comfortable there. It was very heavy on Hebrew text and prayers without a whole lot of explanation. And we can talk later about different levels of Judaism, Reform, Conservative, Orthodox. But it wasn't a place where I felt very welcome or very comfortable. I looked into the temple at Midland. It was a very small temple. I didn't feel a sense of connection there either. And so eventually I found a temple down in Flint where I felt comfortable. That was the good news, was that I liked that place, and I liked the rabbi there, and we were enjoying going there, but we would go there on a Friday night, and then during the rest of the week I had no involvement with anyone from the temple, and I wasn't really kind of integrating Judaism into my life. And, it was a 45-minute drive there on a Friday night, which is fine when the weather's like this, but as you folks know, when the weather gets bad, a longer drive on a Friday night didn't seem like a whole lot of fun. So it was right around that time then that my daughter was born, and I was kind of growing weary of traveling down to Flint and not making a whole lot of connections. And so we just kind of dropped out, I guess, in a sense, in terms of Judaism. And within a couple of years of that time, we got a phone call from someone in town who was Jewish, and they said they were thinking about starting up basically a small temple again in town, a small congregation, I should say. And I was interested, so we went. We had some Friday night services over at a dance studio, which was a little interesting. But I found there was a Jewish community here in town, not a huge one, but a good enough group of young families like ourselves, and I felt a connection there, and we had student rabbis who would travel up from Cincinnati on the weekends, and I really enjoyed the student rabbi, and a couple years after that, we actually did form an official temple here in Saginaw, in the back of Yasmin's on Bay Road, if you know where that is in Saginaw. And we've been doing that for about 4 or 5 years. We had about 40 families who were a part of it, and we continue to have the student rabbis, and I loved being a part of it and involved. And then just a couple of years ago, maybe a year and a half ago, we actually merged now with the temple in Bay City. So we have 2 locations now. We're in Saginaw, we're in Bay City. Combined, we have around 100 families, so we have a pretty strong Jewish presence, although I kind of feel like we're an underground movement, like people don't fully know that we are here and in town, but we are. And I've loved really being a part of it. I've loved our student rabbis. I've loved the other families that I've met through being a part of our Jewish community. I've actually been a board member, both at the merged congregation and when we were a small congregation as well. I've done that now for 5 or 6 years, and I never would have imagined that I would be a temple board member as a child, certainly not as an adolescent. Even in my 20s, I would have severely doubted it, and now as an adult, it's something that I really cherish and I love being a part of.
Very good. Thanks, Dave.
I'd like to ask a question first. I'm Skip Rinker. Have you been studying religion lately in this class? Were you prepared for us in any way as far as religion? We're going to talk about religion, or it's a diversity class, right?
Right.
So I'm just asking, have you anything formal related to religion that you've been reading or talking about before this panel came before you?
Just a little bit of discussion beforehand, and that's it.
Okay, right. I was just curious.
So,
One background.
not much.
Okay. Let's see. I'll try to. You've been listening for a long time already. I'll try to make this not too long. I don't know what I am. I was raised a Catholic, though, and maybe I should say a little about my background. That this does relate ultimately. My father, in the 40s and 50s and 60s and into the 70s, was a resort hotel manager, and in those days, resort hotels were not owned by the big chains. They were almost always privately owned. And he ended up getting jobs in northern Michigan, where I spent every summer growing up. But he always would then take a winter job someplace else, and he didn't always work at the same places. So I grew up in places like Phoenix and Tucson and a couple of towns in Florida, North Carolina, and really traveled all over the country when I was growing up. And I think this has been a good, when I look back on it, it was difficult going from school to school, but it was good in the sense of really being exposed almost to the whole country. You know, we drove across the country twice a year for 20 years while I was growing up, and then ended up at some different place. So there was this sense of, in one way, a sense of diversity, how diverse it is and how big it is. And my dad was not really very churched. He didn't have much of a religion, although he'd been raised Episcopalian sort of very mildly. But my mother was a staunch Catholic, Roman Catholic, and almost in every sense of the word, a good person. She was smart. She was very faithful. As soon as she could, I was the oldest of 10 children, so these trips across the country were with all my brothers and sisters. Wow. So Mom is raising us 10 kids and also trying as often as she can to go to Mass every day, which in my experience in the Catholic Church is a good thing. Most towns, you don't just go on a Saturday or a Sunday, you can go any day of the week to the Catholic Church. And she was what they call a daily, and she would just go daily. This is very important to her. And she mainly emanated this spiritual sense throughout her whole life. So my brothers and sisters and I came up Catholic. But when I was in my early 20s, it was the late 60s, I was questioning, just like so many people in the 60s. And like so many people in the 60s, I got interested in meditation and in Eastern religions. And this was when I was already teaching at Delta, because I started at Delta when I was about 3 years old. But I was very interested in religious questions and religious practice. And I was particularly interested, I would say, more in the inner side of religion than the outer side. You know, David has been talking mainly about outer practices, I would say. He likes it at this particular synagogue and so on. And I think religion has generally a vertical and a horizontal direction. It's almost like a cross, you know. And the vertical direction is more the inner direction, I think. I'm just calling it that, you know, a spatial metaphor, okay? But the inner direction is more prayer, meditation, inward relationship with your faith or with God or whatever you want to call that, whatever you want to call God. And the horizontal dimension is more the practice dimension, the social dimension, the connection with other people dimension, the ritual dimension. And I think I've always been a little more interested in the inner than the outer. So I started meditating on my own, and then I sought out all kinds of teachers over the years, mostly in the Buddhist and Hindu traditions, but also quite a few Catholics in the Benedictine tradition, which is the monastic tradition. So there's monasteries that there are still monasteries of women and men in the United States. Mostly they're Catholic, but some of them are Episcopal, and there are a few others. And there's lots of monasteries now in the United States that are both Buddhist, Hindu. This country has become almost central in the world as far as the monastic tradition goes. Lots of new monasteries. So there's this whole inner side of it for me that's been very important. But at the same time, I've sort of maintained my Catholicism. The Mass is still somehow very important to me. The Eucharist, there's something mysterious and deep about it for me that's just, I don't know. I like going and I like receiving the Eucharist, and I like that connectedness. But I'm what some Catholics would call very disparagingly a cafeteria Catholic. So those cafeteria Catholics select from the menu, and they don't They don't buy everything on the menu. They don't take the whole smorgasbord. They just and they're accused of being not buying the whole package. And I'm definitely a cafeteria Catholic in that sense. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that I think is just doesn't work for me as far as Catholicism goes. So all this has led to the last 8 or 10 years I've been teaching a course at Delta called Introduction to Meditation, which has just been a great fit for me. It's like I just go in there and teach a certain form of Buddhist meditation, but I stress the secular nature of it because this is supposed to be a secular institution. So I can't go in and say, I can't teach Buddhism, but Buddhist meditation is very non-godly, I guess you could say. You don't have to have faith to do it. While I'm talking about
There's
this.
no God in Buddhism.
There's no God in a certain sense. There's no God.
There's no absolute power.
Not exactly that either.
Well, not, yeah.
I'll say one other thing about Buddhism though related to that, and I think this is an important distinction to make too sometimes. The monotheistic religions, Judaism, Islam, and Christianity, are all belief-based. So generally, in order to be, I would say almost certainly, in order to call yourself a Muslim, or call yourself a Catholic, or call yourself a Presbyterian, or call yourself a Jew, you need to believe in a certain set of beliefs. They're laid out for you. Buddhism, no. It's much more practice-oriented. So it's basically what they say. They also say this, I think, in the meditative reaches of Hinduism. Just try it, they say. Try this for a while and see how it works for you, basically. But you don't have to believe anything except that it might work. You don't have to believe, in other words, in the virgin birth, or that Moses is the main prophet, or whatever. You just try it, and then you see whether it works for you. So in a sense, they're more psychologically based. I would say Buddhism is a little more psychologically based. In the beginning, I'm not saying there is not very important psychology in all these other three religions. So, and the other course I've just begun to teach, that's partly why I'm full of all this stuff, is
Red light switch. I love you.
I'm teaching a course called Introduction to World Religions, and I've just started teaching that. So I've been reading a lot, and I'm learning a lot, and there's an awful lot. I'm just learning an incredible amount of what I don't know, just a staggering amount of what I don't know. And I'm concentrating on the 5 most influential religions. I think they probably are the 5 most: Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, and Hinduism. And the rest of those you've listed up there, I don't know very much about many of those, and if students ask me about them, I sort of say, well, just go to the internet and look that one up. Or I just say what little I know. So that's my story for the moment.
And that's just our little list that we came
No, that's
up
just a
with
tiny
just
little
this
list,
class
that's
alone, which is pretty good.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. But we have some people that have had some broad experience. So. Who wants to ask the first question?
As you're formulating the first question, let me sort of tie it back, as I understand this sort of class on diversity. One point I wanted to make was that from sort of a laissez-faire or free market economy that we are in, it makes perfect economic sense to have the diversity that's reflected in the vendors, customers, suppliers, partners, you name it, right? So when companies across the country are embracing diversity in their workforce, in their offering to their customers, they're doing what is the right thing economically and rationally for them to. So I just wanted to sort of make that point across, where sometimes, people are trying to come up with a rationale or justification. It makes perfect economic sense to be doing, to be sort of, to be embracing the diversity that is reflected in your customers, in your vendors, in your and in various facets of doing business.
I kind of think it makes human sense too. I mean, if we stay thinking that we have all these different paths and we're the only right one and we have to go in and fix it for everybody else, we're just going to continue to be involved in all these wars until we just obliterate the human race. I mean, we have got to learn to embrace and honor all of our differences. There's no choice. It's my perspective.
Absolutely. Okay.
I wanted to ask you why Greg, you mentioned earlier, you said, you referred to Christianity as a Western religion. One of the largest pockets of Christianity in the world is in India. And yet, and I hear it too, I mean, Christianity is a Western religion. Where do we get that mindset from? And conversely, you mentioned the Eastern religions, or one of the largest pockets of Islam in the world, or in this part of the world, is right here in Detroit. So how do we get that division of Western, Eastern religion? Faith is throughout the world. So, I mean, I know that there's different religions throughout the world, but why do we make that distinction, and how do we get it?
Why do you think?
Well, I think because the Christian faith has grown so much in this country, but it didn't start in this country. It started in Jerusalem. I mean, so it's not its start here, but it seems to have blossomed here to a large extent. But that doesn't, I think that's only part of it.
Oh, the question for me. I don't know why. I would guess that it would be considered a Western theology because it was Western Europe. That would be my guess. I don't know. I'm not a historian or a geographer. That's what we read in the books.
Yeah, these strange distinctions were set up, I think, mainly in the 19th century, and I'm not a historian either, where we started calling Western Europe,
Right.
and then we started calling what we now call the Middle East, and then we started calling these other countries, the Far East. But that's all from the perspective, of course, of the West,
Yes.
of what we call the West.
What we call the West.
So those are really just odd labels. I mean, if you're in China, you're probably not thinking using those kind of terms for these
Right.
regions. Okay.
Actually, those are very ethnocentric terms, aren't they? Because they
Yeah,
really
absolutely.
just are all terms that focus on if you're in America, then that is the Far East. But if you're in the Far East, that's not the Far East.
But we're considered the West, though. But we don't consider ourselves the West.
See, this is interesting. Maybe to build on sort of your question one step further, sort of we tend to, as human beings, we tend to sort of pigeonhole people, right? As I meet somebody, I quickly try to make a determination around that person, that individual, based on what I see or what I know about them. And like one of the stereotypes about Islam is about sort of Arab Americans and Arabs being Muslims, and they represent less than 15% of the Muslims in the world, right? Out of the 1.6 billion people, less than 15% are Arabs. And similarly, there are Christian Arab Americans, there are Jewish Arab Americans, and we have several here in the US. I have a list here I was going to do a small quiz with the folks, but this is probably a good time to stop doing the quiz. I'll read 8 names off to you, starting with Jack Nasser, who was the former CEO of Ford, John Mack, for those who don't know, CEO of Morgan Stanley, Ralph Nader, I think pretty much everybody would know about him, Tony Shalhoub, who played Monk in the TV serial, if anybody watches that one, Selma Hayek, the actress, George Mitchell, the former Senate Majority Leader, Casey Kasem, who used to do the top 20 or top 40 singles, and then Dr. Emmetsville, who's a Nobel laureate out of Caltech. All Arab Americans, right? So, but typically when you ask people sort of how many of them are Arab Americans, they may say 2 or 3, but there's sort of this joint heritage, and I think these are sort of almost, we have created these pigeonholes, but there's sort of much more sort of close-knit sort of relationships between the ethnic groups, and if you peel the onion, what you find is they're even within a specific ethnic group, or within, for example, picking up Islam as an example, there's as much diversity in that faith as it would be in any other faith.
Yes. This has been very reinforced for me by teaching this course, realizing that every one of these faiths in itself is incredibly diverse. And there's a spectrum of opinion and a spectrum of belief, just way across the spectrum. So.
Yeah, with Judaism in particular, I was starting to mention earlier, we have different, I never know the right term, groups or levels within Judaism. Orthodox are the most, I guess, traditional in a sense. They will not drive, they will not do any kind of work, they will not use anything that requires work from sundown Friday night through sundown Saturday night during the Sabbath. They walk to temple, they typically live very close to temples. Oftentimes they keep kosher, which has a lot of restrictions in terms of dietary practices. And then on the other extreme are Reform Jews, where this is where it always gets a little bit messier. It's easiest to talk about the Orthodox. Somewhere in between the two, by the way, is conservative. Reform is a bit more liberal in terms of how we practice our faith. I am Reform. And so we still believe in the Torah, we believe in God, but in terms of the practices, they're not as adherent to maybe what the Orthodox Jews are doing, and conservative, like I said, somewhere in between. And so I think a lot of the stereotypes that are out there in regard to Judaism tend to be more focused probably around Orthodox Jews.
Right.
There are others that kind of go across the entire spectrum, but it's a great point to make that within any group, whether we're talking men, whether we're talking about athletes, whether we're talking about homosexuals, whether we're talking about Christians, and while the stereotypes may hold true for some people in the group, they certainly don't hold true for everyone in the group, and often they don't even describe a majority, but they may describe some. That doesn't necessarily mean it describes that person or that person. So I'm glad you brought up the point, though, about stereotypes and generalizations.
Good question to start the dialogue.
Question. Let me ask a question. Where would the concept of social justice, would that be something that each one of you faith communities focus on? Would it be something that would be brought up and discussed in a religious point of view, or what is your ideal of social justice?
In what regard do you mean that, Cherise?
Yeah.
If you don't mind me asking.
Just in terms of whether or not it's even a concept that's talked about within your faith or within your religion. And when I say social justice, I mean it in the most broadest sense. What is social justice? Does it come into play at all, or is it not something that's really discussed? Is it more,
I'll go first.
Okay, go ahead.
For me, social justice is intrinsic with your faith, like how you practice it and how you behave in society. But there's a real fine line as a minister practicing in the United States that you can't cross into politics.
Right.
So a lot of social justice, even though it's social justice, it plays into politics. And that's just where there's a rule that I don't go there, because that's part of our oath and part of being able to practice your religion in the United States is you stay away from politics. There's a division of religion and state. And so, no, I can't. I even when I want to, like when there's things happening like 9/11 or horrific things, and people will come to me and they'll ask, and on a one-on-one I might give them an opinion, and they're like, well, can't you say anything? I'm like, so indirectly I may be able to. I can suggest things. Like when we went in and we as a country killed the leader, what was his name now? Bin Laden. And I looked on TV and I saw all these people celebrating in Washington, all the rabble and all the yelling. And then they'd show Bin Laden, this peaceful man sitting there talking to people, all dressed in white, almost like a Jesus or something. And I looked at the juxtaposition and how we were celebrating that we killed this person. And people would come to me and they'd say, how do you feel about this? And I'm like, can't say anything. But on Sunday, I could address how we deal with diversity. And we cannot kill our problems by shooting someone. By killing another person does not fix the problem, because there'll be another one right behind and another one, because there's a fundamental belief that person is acting with. It's not the person, it's some of their thoughts. And those thoughts don't go away when the person goes away. And so I couldn't mention Bin Laden or anything, but I could definitely address the behavior. But you have to be careful with that.
See, the way I sort of think about social justice, I'm sure it's sort of part of the inherent fabric of any faith by definition. So,
Right.
the common practices and good practices that bring out the kernels of good in all human beings versus, and suppresses some of the kernels of evil that all of us have. So a couple of thoughts come to sort of as it relates to Islam. One is around sort of Prophet Muhammad and his sermon last sermon he had migrated out to Medina in the middle of his life years, and now he comes back to Makkah, and this is sort of the last major sermon he gives at Hajj, sort of it's a gathering of annual pilgrimage, and he says that no sort of human being is more superior than the other based on their color of their skin, based on their ethnicity, based on the language they speak, based on if they're rich or poor, but it's based on their deeds and awareness of God and how they act on those based on that awareness, right? So, that to me sort of creates sort of the level playing field. And it's interesting this week as we are sort of having this conversation. 7 days from now will be that annual pilgrimage. And having been there 5 years ago, one thing you notice is this: roughly between 2.5 to 3 million people from all over the world that are there. And for the couple of weeks that they go through the different sort of rituals of the pilgrimage, each is dressed identically in 2 white sheets, right? So as you're walking down the street, or if you're in the Grand Mosque in Makkah saying a prayer, and with hundreds of thousands around you, the next person next to you, you have no idea about this social structure. It could be the president of another country with a delegation, or it could be somebody who has hitchhiked from Somalia and gotten there, right? To me, that is the perfect equalizer, where it's more like you're sort of getting to know them as an individual, rather than if I'm wearing a Cartier or a Gucci watch, or if I'm wearing a fine suit. So that is one, talking about sort of some rituals where it sort of is trying to equate everybody and bring them sort of to the same level. So just wanted to share.
Minimizing the pigeonholing, which we were speaking of earlier.
I'd answer, I guess, in a couple of ways. One of the key beliefs in Judaism is that it's important to practice something called tzedakah, which is charity, which is helping others. And for a lot of Jews, around the high holidays, Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, and or during the Sabbath on Friday nights, there's a tzedakah box. People are encouraged to make donations to help out others who are in need. And so a big principle of Judaism also is the notion of advocacy, helping others. We realized that it wasn't that long ago that 6 million Jews were annihilated as part of the Holocaust, and had it not been for others, other countries, other non-Jews trying to assist, it could have totally destroyed, completely destroyed Judaism. A lot of Jews were able to survive, and we realized that others helped us. The belief is that when people are in need, we need to help them as well. So I think those are both critical concepts in Judaism in regard to advocacy.
Just to build on that a little bit, it seems to me that, many people interpret the Bible, the Christian Bible, which of course piggybacks on the so-called Old Testament, which is also a Christian term. It's not,
Right.
Jews call it the Torah.
They call it the Torah.
Yeah, right.
Right.
First 5 books.
But both, as well as, if I understand it right, the teachings of Islam, there's a strong emphasis on helping the poor. And if you really think about that, not very many people carry this as far as I would like them to carry it. But the idea then is that we live in we live in a society where goods are distributed unequally. And there needs to be some way to bring about some change in the level of those who are at the bottom. And that seems to me really important, at least in the 3 monotheistic religions. That's a really big one. And so that's resulted in things like tithing, or people giving a certain amount of their income. But a lot of the people I admire in the various traditions, like Thomas Merton, for example, who was died in the late 60s, but very well-known monk at the time, wrote very often about social justice issues. Another woman named Dorothy Day, who founded the Catholic Worker, which was very much a kind of far-left publication. And the Dalai Lama, I would say, in his work with Tibetan refugees and attempting to figure out some way for Tibet to maintain its identity, these are all these are all, in my mind, very strong social justice issues. And I personally would like to see the churches wake up to this, but I understand Greg's point. And often when I go to Mass, I don't want the priest to tell me, like, for instance, the Catholic Church is the official position of the Catholic Church is very strongly anti-abortion. And I'm very mixed about this. And I don't want to hear the priest on either side of this issue.
Right.
I don't want to hear him talk about it. I just don't. And so I don't know how that fits, but I think if you go to church for one thing maybe, but I think it's perfectly okay then as soon as you're outside of the church or talking to somebody one-to-one, or even you're involved in a particular group in your community, if you want to use your godly principles to support your idea of social justice, I think that's fine. And I'd like to see a lot more Christians moving in this direction. And these last couple of wars we've had, most Christians have been way back there. Not enough speaking up by ministers and bishops and so on about, we're just getting out of these wars we've been in for 10 years now. So that's my take on it.
Well, I purposely left that open-ended and vague because I just wanted to see where everybody was on it, and I didn't want to sway anyone. And I kind of really liked your analogy, Skip, of the cross, because I think that religion there are two levels. One is your own personal relationship with whomever, higher power or whatever. And the other one is, why does religion even exist in society? And for me, I think it's that social justice ideal. And the social justice ideal comes back to all the things you guys talked about. It comes back to the golden rule. It comes back to charity. It comes back to equality. And those are some of the tenets of those are some of the shared common values that most religions have. And so if we do this as practice, and we do this as our own personal growth, then is that what religion is all about? Because in the past, religion has sometimes been about killing others in the name of God. Now, what do you think about that? Let's go to the other perspective now.
What do you mean in the past?
Okay, sorry. You're right.
I think the term holy war is probably the biggest oxymoron I've ever heard.
Before we go
You
in that
cannot
direction,
save someone's soul by killing them.
yeah, that's right. I did want to touch on sort of one parallel that I wanted to touch on that Dave mentioned, and again, so many things that practices are so identical. So practice of charity or alms. If you came to the Islamic Center, if it's the old one in the city of Saginaw or the new one, you'd see a box, and the box has the word sadaqah written on it. The Hebrew Aramaic root word in Arabic means the exact same thing and the same idea. So imagine, so pretty much many people, millions that are practicing the same faith, be it sort of on Sabbath or be it on Friday when they're doing the exact same thing with the same box written on it, right? But that doesn't get talked about. There's sort of probably other things that get picked up. There's another concept very close to sadaqah of zakat, which is taking 2.5% of your earnings every year, and actually it's more 2.5% of your annual earnings and any savings, and then distributing them out for charity. But that's not exclusive to Islam or Judaism. I think probably other than the monotheistic faiths, I have seen in sort of several other faiths, be it Hinduism or Buddhism, this concept of charity that sort of is very much central to the core of their existence.
It's a great point. I think a lot of times we do look for differences, and maybe that's part of the purpose of the panel is to see what are the differences between the various religions. But it's a great point that we have so much in common too. I teach psychology here at Delta, and we spend a lot of time talking about male-female differences, but I always start by saying we have a lot of stuff in common. We all have noses, we all have elbows, we all breathe, and then we talk about the differences. They're small, some are more significant than others, but it's great to realize that we have a lot of things that really we have in common.
And we talk a lot in here about shared common values also. So then let's go to the hardcore issues of how and why, and what are the situations where we as humans have actually killed others in the name of religion. How do you think that came about?
I just have one reflection on that, I guess, for the moment, would be one of my favorite sayings of the Buddha in some sort of older translation is, he said, "Seek not to cherish opinions." And a lot of what Buddhism is about is seeing clearly the workings of your own mind and realizing how quickly and easily the mind moves to categories and generalizations and opinions. And then what happens is, I think just almost on a scientific level, is these get hardened then, and people act from these very hardened minds and hardened positions. And one hardened mind attracts another hardened mind, and then you end up, with proscriptions about all kinds of stuff. And when you look back, historically, our record, especially the record of the monotheistic religions, is really bad. So you have, we don't need to go into all the details. The Crusades alone, the historical record on both sides is a bunch of hardened minds set up categories, and then the category becomes something like infidel, and then it makes it much easier to kill this person because you've stuck them in this category.
And the category is not like me.
The category is not like me.
If
Exactly.
I can plant hate, then I can justify murder.
Exactly.
If we can create an enemy.
Right.
If we can create an enemy. And so if we think that we have an enemy in the first place, what a ludicrous idea that is. But if we have a belief that there's an enemy, then in order to beat the enemy, we have to convince everybody else that there's an enemy. And so the president, in order to win a war, is, of course, there's the enemy and God is on our side. Well, what do you think they're saying over there?
That's what Hitler said when he tried to wipe out the Jewish people. They are the enemy.
So I think really the solution is to look at the similarities and to honor the differences instead of making people think they have to be like us, is to honor the differences, and it's great to find your similarities. Like I love the whole thing about the white and finding similarities, and at the same time, I like seeing the diversity of all the different colors. So there's benefits to both sides. So it's never either or, but it's both and. And if we could do that with our beliefs, that'd be a whole different world.
See, another way to maybe think about the same is sort of in the past decade, post 9/11, sort of things were painted as black and white, right? And life, as I see it, is shades of gray, right? And if you start sort of claiming that you're on one side, which is pure, and sort of everyone else or a vast majority on the other side is impure, that's a recipe for disaster. Because guess what the other side's doing? But what's the interesting element is what this black and white picture, though I feel sort of that's been painted, the artists that are painting this picture represent, maybe they're 5 degrees away from the normal, right? So they represent 0.0005%. They may be very vocal in each of the different faiths or different nationalities, but they in no way, shape, or form represent a critical mass, right? But they have sort of owned this argument and they've tried to portray it. But I think that becomes even more important to have conversations like this to start thinking about more common ground rather than to pick the extreme opinions and try to draw differences.
Yeah, in terms of the Holocaust, it gets kind of complicated, obviously, and here's my simplistic kind of understanding. Ultimately 6 million Jews more or less were annihilated, but a lot of African Americans, a lot of people who were mentally retarded, were also destroyed by Hitler and the Nazis because they believed that these were people who were taking away resources from them. And, like I said earlier, they were not like me. They were different somehow. They looked at the differences. And it took a few very hardened minds and a few vocal supporters. And then what starts happening is you've got obedience to authority figures. Hey, look, you're going to kill the Jews. Well, guess what? I don't have that hatred in my heart. You don't? Well, we might kill you and your family. Now, are you going to kill the Jews? And it becomes very pervasive when people have very little freedom, very few options in those scenarios, and then it kind of spreads like wildfire until eventually, somehow miraculously, it ends.
Just a slight other angle on that. I think it's great that we're doing this, and I think it's great we have these kind of conversations, and I think it's great that we look for what we have in common and so on. And I also think somehow there needs to be a massive change of mind and heart. And in a way, that's a psychological thing. That's part of what I was trying to say about the Buddhist approach, which is, one of the great things about going to college is, generally, I think most people learn that start to make distinctions then. That's part of what you're about in college is you no longer can get away with so many stereotypes and generalities. Well, you still need to make another step, which I think is a spiritual step somehow, and that's somehow within yourself, you've got to see really clearly when you're doing this, when you yourself are generalizing, or you yourself are leaning in the direction of hatred, or, this is like a person by person thing that needs to be, you have to do it person by person. And somehow that needs to be, I've used hardened mind before, I'm just going to go off my metaphor here. So soft mind has to meet soft mind, has to meet soft mind, receptive mind. So it's not just a matter of just talking to each other. It's a matter of really internal change. People have to change internally. And that's a tall order to get, I don't think we're ever going to get rid of evil, but I think we can live in a world that's a lot less susceptible to evil, and I think that has to do with changing people's minds.
I agree, and I think a lot of it too comes from keeping others in check. When people start spewing hatred, to be able to say, I'm not going to listen to this, or I disagree with you, or I'm going to walk away. I don't want to associate with someone, who's spewing that kind of venom, or to say, I don't share that belief. I don't feel that way. I don't think people in this particular group are all like that. And it takes a lot of courage to be able to do that too.
So to be able to speak up and speak up.
Yeah, speak up, or at the very least, don't tolerate it by leaving.
But as you said earlier, that Hitler's people were, if you don't agree, we're going to kill you too.
Right.
So, a lot of the people, I know a man who was in the SS in World War II. He absolutely hated what they stood for, but it was a matter of, if you don't join, we're going to kill your mother and your brother and all the rest of this stuff. And they ultimately did, and that's when he deserted from the SS. Because, but that's how they got their army going, was through hatred and fear for your own life.
Right.
Either you're going to kill him or we're going to kill you, and then we're going to kill him, so either way he's going to be dead, so what do you want?
Yeah, and those are much, obviously at that point, the stakes are so high. Whereas I think what we deal with in our society with people that we know, I think the stakes are a lot lower. If you say something that I disagree with, I could say I disagree with you, or I'm not going to listen to that. The stakes are lower. To be able to walk away in a situation like that takes a lot of courage.
Questions? Any questions? Well, we just have a few more minutes, so I'm going to toss out a difficult one for everyone. And you can take this any direction that you want to, kind of with your final words. America, our country, has been called one of the most theistic, in terms of religion.
But maybe not in terms of going to church, affiliating with a specific religious organization. So, I think it's becoming more of an issue for, a lot of different religious faiths, that they're seeing fewer people attending services, people who consider themselves members of that particular faith. They may have beliefs, but they may just not attend services regularly. They may not, consider themselves a member of a specific congregation or church.
Makes a lot of sense.
For me, I'm excited about it because I see it as us changing and us not being satisfied with the old answers and the old organizations. And I see it as a wake-up call to those of us who are supporting some of these organizations, that we're not meeting people's needs. People's needs are changing. People's understanding are changing. And if we're not helping them to be part of the community, and if we're just staying here, we have to have both, and we have to apply to both. And if people are leaving, good, they're leaving. It's a wake-up call. I don't think that's a bad thing necessarily. I agree. I think people are still consider themselves very spiritual, and so how we integrate that in a more global world, because we're a much smaller world now. I don't know what the answer is going to be, but I have total faith that the answer will be provided, that we're part of the answer. One of the things that's unique about Unity too, it keeps coming up, is that God necessarily is not necessarily a theistic deity. So we would be more in Buddhism in that respect than most of these other religions. There's a God, like a power or deity, and we don't do that, so we're a little different.
See, at the sort of micro level, if I just look at sort of the faith, my specific faith, Islam, and within Saginaw, we have the reverse issue, which is a good problem to have, where the community's been growing in leaps and bounds, and we opened a new Islamic center to support it, right? But that's sort of, coming to your question specifically, I think because there's a fair bit of cynicism around, right? Cynicism because of the times we live in, cynicism because of sort of the economic conditions we are in the past, several years, and that sometimes can have, two extreme reactions, right? Either in those times you really reach out to God Almighty, or at times you're just sort of turned off, right? And but I think I want to think that people still have sort of in the heart of how the spirituality, and that maybe at a very high level of spirituality, but they're looking for the right path, right? And then it sort of depends on the sort of the religious clergy and others that are in the various denominations to help them find the path, right? And not one path is right for all of them, right? At a given point in time, even as they evolve over time, as they age, different paths may be better suited to their needs. So, but overall, yeah, I'm at the same time, I see in these hardened times, I go and I see sort of people really reaching out to other human beings to help, other fellow citizens to help. So they're trying to do and they're trying to practice a lot of things that are good religious values. And so overall, we if we look at sort of outside of the U.S., sort of let's sort of look at other parts of the world. Let's look at Asia. I think sort of spirituality and religions is actually in ascendance there in many ways, where you're seeing as sort of the societies are moving from sort of quote unquote countries from the third world to the second world, as they're becoming a little bit more materialistic. But people are still searching, and they're trying to make sure they remain grounded in some faith. So if you go to India or China or Japan or Pakistan, you're going to find that despite sort of people going up the economic sort of staircase, they are struggling and they are trying hard to find the right sort of balance between their life and between sort of the faith that they have, between what they're practicing in this world and sort of thinking about the afterlife. So I'm very positive and hopeful in that way.
I'll make this just snappy, I guess. Well, one thing that I'm hopeful about is the spread of true wisdom and knowledge throughout the world that's coming from so many religions now. And when I say true wisdom and knowledge, for me, the extreme, especially the extreme right, is a problem. But there's so much wisdom and knowledge available that wasn't available even 30 or 40 years ago now to people in the United States. So you're sitting here in this classroom. 40 years ago, you would not have sat on a panel with a Muslim, forget him. And this Unity guy, he probably wouldn't have been around. Right? And there would not have been a class in diversity, probably. So all these ideas are spreading, and as they spread, I think part of what's being discovered is that all these religions, in my opinion, have basically the same core. Basically the same core. There's a lot of different practices and rituals and even beliefs, but the core is there. And as people recognize that, it doesn't exactly matter how many millions, as long as that core is spreading, it doesn't matter whether there's 2 billion Muslims or 1 billion Catholics or whatever. It's like that's what really has the effect, I think. and I'm just making this up as I go on, but I'm hoping this is true. This is my hope. I just put it as a hopeful thing, And otherwise, as you said, Greg, where are we going? What's the alternative? The alternative is blowing ourselves up, environmental disaster, et cetera, et cetera. You have to have the sport.
Well, thank you for very, very thoughtful comments from everyone. Really appreciate it.